and she learned the arts of eloquence and writing, calculus, horse riding, and bravery, and she learned all the handicrafts of men and women until she became unique in her epoch. The story of Nur al-Din and Mariam the Beltmaker. Why do you not as well our battles fight and wear our armor? Suffer this, and then let all the world be topsy-turved quite. Elizabeth Carey, The Tragedy of Mariam, the Fair Queen of Jewry. When we finished our Zascher Torte and drank up our coffee, Basil rose to his feet and told me to wait. Just as I reached for my tote, starting to stand up myself, he said, "Stay put, my love. I'll be right back." He pulled a blue envelope out of his inside jacket pocket and walked off toward the door, gone in a fraction of a second. And so I had no choice but to remain seated and wait, my hand still on my bag, my mind slightly numb with surprise, trying to settle back into the cushioned wrought iron chair as unclumsily as possible, trying to settle into the new reality of Basil's vanishing act. It wasn't a comfortable wait. Our marble-topped two-seater was beginning to take on that sad, trashed air of vacated cafe tables. When my edgy eyes locked with the waitresses, I felt obliged to give her a guilty smile from my awkward solitary corner in apology for this inopportune hiatus before the check. She beamed back at me with a playfully commiserative look in her eyes, as if to say, "I wonder what your husband is up to this time." And I just sat there and waited, watching time drip and dribble away moment by moment, pondering my options as the seconds ticked by. There was a pocket edition of the Rubaiyat in my tote. I took it out, opened it at random, and began to read, my eyes fidgeting between Khayyam's verse and the door through which Basil had vanished with his secret in his hand. Endless minutes of restless reading. Then just as I started to lose patience, my mercurial husband came back in, striding briskly across the carpeted room toward our little out-of-the-way alcove. With a broad smile on his playful mischief-maker face, he sat down opposite me, again, as if no interruption had intervened between us, and held out that strange pastel blue envelope. I tossed the book back into my bag and took his envelope. It felt a bit bulky as I unsealed it. There was a bulging card inside. Carefully, I laid the envelope on the table and pulled the card out among the remains of our twosome coffee clatch. A get well wish was inscribed in gold capital letters on the china blue cover. With my right hand, I pressed the message side of the card flat on the table, and with my left, I flipped it open, revealing a Parker fountain pen inside. I lifted the pen and read Basil's note. "Write the full story, please do, and I will proudly translate it, your first world literature piece. You can write it and put the whole thing behind you. I know you can. The hell with facts and research. Write it with your imagination, and it'll be as true as anything you've ever written. I know you're a poet, and prose can sometimes be even more complicated than poetry, but I also know that thanks to your amazing imagination, the result will be enchanting. You have read all the books and watched all the movies and documentaries. Let the writing begin. P.S. The elderly lady who has just sold me the Parker in the gift shop told me she had been seeing us at the Silver Spoon for years. You always look so wonderful together, she said, the picture-perfect couple. She was very nice, said you looked like Samantha Eggar, and meant it as a big compliment. I looked up from the card and gazed at my husband in silence, in a mix of amazement and gratitude. He handed me the presentation box across the table, grinning proudly like a man who had finalized a satisfying deal. Later, when we got home, I sat down in my study to try out the new pen. I filled it with ink, opened my diary, and commenced to write. He's right. This is probably the best time to do it. It's 1976, and the summer will be brimming with beautiful signs and symbols for millions of us. Basil's work is going very well at the Comp-Lit department. He's writing a great book, and his colleagues love us. The Bloomington spring has hit the hills around town, swift as usual, wild and disarranging. The cherry trees are nodding with the mad blossoming of April, and we're all rooting for Jimmy, at least this part of Indiana. The future looks bright and beautiful. There is no better time than now to talk about the past, that other spring, the roiling years that led up to it. It was the spring Ollie decided I was old enough to be entrusted with the security of our mother's home. "From now on, you're the man of the house," my brother said. "Actually, as soon as we roll out of the courtyard," he corrected himself with a wink. "Here, take it. It's yours. You've earned it." Ollie held out the Beretta, and in his huge palm it looked toy-like and diminutive. The twinkle in his eyes was a strange mix of paternal pride and teenage pranksterism. I took it and put it in the pocket of my safari jacket, the practice jacket he had bought for me in Alexandria. "When are you leaving?" I asked. "After tomorrow at the crack of dawn, the trip to end all trips. We're going to milk this lull in the fighting for all it's worth, sister. It's going to be good for business and good for our neighbors." "Are you nervous already? Where's the toughness you told me about? Has it deserted you already?" Ali's playful green eyes crackled with bantering mischief, my brother's way of managing his nervousness. "What are you talking about? I'm not nervous. I know your guns in and out. I'm your gun cleaner, for heaven's sake. You even let me clean the Winchester once, didn't you? And a fine job you did, too. And now you've fired your first live rounds, and we know you're a natural. What more could you want? Actually, we won't really know before you've tried the Walter. Are you excited?" "Of course I am, you know that. But as I said, I clean them up. I take care of them. I dry fire some of them. I know your guns through and through. You don't have to worry." "I'm not worried. I know I can trust you fully. That's why I'm giving you this, with the Beretta." He pulled a box of ammunition out of the pocket of his bomber jacket, waved it before me with a teasing grin. "A whole box!" I gasped. "Yes, and I know you're going to use it responsibly. Hide it well inside the house, but keep it within easy reach for yourself. You have to show me where you're going to hide it. While I'm away, all safety rules still apply. No changes whatsoever. Dummy rounds and dry firing by yourself. Blanks and target balloons with Sergeant Saeed. Live once a week with Sergeant Saeed. Now that you've got your own live bullets." Sergeant Saeed was my brother's nickname for our house guard. The sergeant, my sister and I called him Uncle Awad, came from Damietta and used to be a gunnery officer in the Egyptian army before he joined us. He had a number of firearms in his home and had taught my father and two brothers everything they knew about weapons. His military days were long behind him, though, and he now dressed very much like most men from northern Egypt, a traditional galabiya and kaftan with those huge wide sleeves, a scarlet tarbush with a white turban wound around its rim. The erstwhile Egyptian soldier who guarded our house was quite literally the living image of the man from the Nile Delta, the tall, traditionally clad stock character you see in practically every Egyptian movie from the 50s. There was never any variation in the way he dressed, except for two things. In the hot months, he traded his turban and tarbush for a snow-white skull cap, and in the cold months, he topped his galabiya and kaftan with a russet-brown camel hair binish. Uncle Awad lived with his family in a small annex on our front courtyard. His wife, Muna, we called her Auntie Muna, helped mother with household chores, and his teenage son, Antar, ran our errands. My brother remained silent for a long, uncomfortable moment. The expression of his face altered with an all too sudden, all too unusual look of sad gravity. The sun was going down fast behind Municipio, and the livid shadows of early evening began to descend on the back court like smoke. Our black and white target stood as if suspended in the shadow of the north wall, its rusty frame invisible against the dark mass of the tire backstop. There were noises of kitchen clatter behind the walls separating us from the house patio. Dinner time approaching. He leaned toward me and said, "I can trust you with these deadly weapons, sister, can't I?" The amber starbursts around his pupils were like streaks of luminescence converging toward the pitch-black center of his intelligent eyes. "That's absolutely right," I replied. "You can trust me." With his eyes still fixed on me, he pointed back over his shoulder toward the outside stairs and the rooftop laundry room. That laundry room was the highest point of our house. He said, "The binoculars, Mariam. Will you remember what I told you?" "I know the rules by heart, brother." "I know, but I want you to repeat them for me just the same." "Use them upstairs, inside the laundry room only. Always keep them in their case. Don't let anybody see them. Never lean outside the laundry room windows when using them. Keep at a safe distance from the laundry room windows. And last but not least, when observing with the binoculars, don't be excessively nosy. Stay focused on the harbor, the docks, and the piers from the north window, and Piazza Municipio from the south window. You don't have to worry about me, Ollie." "I'm not worried," he said. He was worried, though, just as anyone else would be under the circumstances. It was the spring of '42, and Benghazi, once again under Mussolini's fascist regime, was turning into an exponentially dangerous city, where burglary, kidnapping, and even murder were becoming commonplace. I asked him about Esther. Muhammad spoke with Mr. Sands at length, and Mr. Sands spoke with his wife. We told him the fascists had put up this week's list on the door of the synagogue. Their names were on it. He said he wouldn't tell Mrs. Sands. It was enough aggravation for him already. Ali saw the worried look on my face, and he leaned toward me again, speaking in a whisper, slowly and deliberately. "Do not get worked up, sister, not now. Sergeant Said knows and is watching out. Antar knows and is watching out. Uncle Ibrahim knows and is watching out. Everybody in the neighborhood is on the lookout. More importantly, we do have a getaway solution for them. We just need Uncle Kareem to help us with our solution when we get to Alexandria. Trust me, by the time we get back, the Sansa's troubles will be over. We just need to help them lay low for a few days." The next day, Ali gave me the Walter, and I had my second target shoot with live ammunition. This time Muhammad and Uncle Awad were there. And when I was done demonstrating my skills with the weapon, there was a long silence in which only Ali was beaming, the deeply satisfied grin of a proud, contented instructor presenting an exceptional pupil. Muhammad walked up to the target and studied it gravely. We crowded around him, waiting for the verdict. When he spoke, he raised his index finger and looked in Uncle Awad's direction, as if the flawless demonstration was his work. "Astounding marksmanship," he declared. "You have my blessings, as long as everything is conducted with circumspection, under Sergeant Said's supervision, of course." Our older brother's understated but intense physical presence was the diametrical opposite of Ali's trim and tall elegance, his restless energy and winsome trickster's eyes. Our family head had the same compact Andalusian build as our father, the same short, go-getter muscular efficiency, the same prominent martial brow glowing above his steady black eyes like burnished bronze. Muhammad's short crop of curly black hair hugged his oval head like a protective coat of steel wool. When he made a fist, his hand looked like a sledgehammer. the precocious leader of our family, forced by fate and circumstances to assume a paternalistic gravity beyond his 20 years. Later, when I showed Ali where I was going to hide the weapons, he sensed my misgivings about our brother's reaction. He spoke as much in defense of Muhammad as to reassure me. He is very impressed, believe me. He's also very, very proud of you. He just feels that he needs to appear sort of aloof and neutral. I guess he feels he's become the head of the family a bit too soon. Your new responsibility reminds him of his. Also, he thinks he always has to appear serious, to make up for father's, absence. Father's absence. The word we never dared to use always lurked behind our family euphemism like a nameless kernel of pain, the ghost of an unforgettable fracture buried deep in our bones, a throbbing wedge of rage lodged in the depths of our being. The death date we never forgot, and the terrible manner of his death. A good man overtaken by the end in the unlikeliest place, alone and helpless in the beloved wholesale store that had been his livelihood since he was a teenager. Father died of a heart attack on March 25th, 1939. It was his uncle who found him, the man we all call Uncle Ibrahim. He dropped in at the wholesale store for a chat and discovered him in one of the storage rooms, slumped face down over a bag of coffee. He passed away 4 days after I had turned 12, and so I found myself orphaned at the same age he had been. The wedding of my sister Zainab was planned for the summer of 1941. He didn't live to give her away. She was 15, he 45. Up until that day, we were an ordinary, progressive Benghazi family, shaped by the universal love, tolerance, and pacifism of our faith. We're deeply secretive, blindly committed Sanusi Sufis, still capable of leading a peaceful, uncomplicated life in spite of all the horrid things Mussolini's fascists had done to our country. We lived on Mahdi Street, a stone's throw away from the most beautiful harbor and the most beautiful fish market in the world, 2 doors down from Ibrahim Mahdi, the celebrated marksman, the fabled Sufi leader, and the providential uncle who became like a father to our father when he was orphaned. By the time father had turned 15, they were trade associates, with the 2 men's names elegantly printed on their business stationery and envelopes, Ibrahim Mahdi and Ahmad Khaldoun, 2 importers running a prosperous company out of the 19th century Ottoman building affectionately called the Whale, that gigantic Shashir Street wholesale store inherited by our father and his mother upon our grandfather's death. Over the years, the names of the 2 men who operated out of the Whale became locally synonymous with high-quality imports and fine exotic products. Within a few years, they had managed to build an excellent business reputation, importing coffee from Yemen and Ethiopia, tea from Ceylon and China, spices and textiles from everywhere. Their main trading partner was mother's cousin, Karim Akram, a big import-export merchant and head of a company operating out of Alexandria, Egypt. Once every spring, father and Uncle Ibrahim would charter a school bus from the Benghazi school district, load up one of the company trucks with food and barbecue meat, and take the Mahdi and Khaldoun families to the Green Mountain for a barbecue picnic at Kurina. I have the fondest memories of those picnics with my siblings and my cousins. Our parents would allow us children to play hide and seek in the temple, run among the ruins and the statues. We played at giving them all kinds of names and imaginary personality traits. My favorite was the Ruthless Hunter, a headless woman in marble with a spear resting against her right flank and the fingers of her left hand dug into the mane of a vanquished lion at her feet. One of the high points of our day-long outing was a ritual dear to Uncle Ibrahim, a visit to a sprawling apiary run by a Sufi shepherd who always welcomed the two patriarchs very warmly, treating our uncle like a national hero. Together, the three men would reminisce about the proud nationalist tradition expressed by one single word among Benghazians who shared their belief: loyalty, the rallying cry that marked their enduring allegiance to Omar Mukhtar and the anti-fascist cause. Then they would go to a mud hut built by the Cyrenian shepherd, where he would sell them his finest honeys, including the rare and highly prized wild varieties harvested from the trees. Loyalty. For us Khaldoons, the watchword was more than a political symbol. It was also a mode of belief and a day-to-day practice that helped our family remain faultlessly united in those days of deep unrest. The loyalty code instilled in us was all the more binding for being taught chiefly by example, with mother and father adhering to it strictly in their relationship. To take one instance, loyalty played a major role in keeping our parents cohesive on the question of their daughter's upbringing, in helping them display flawless unity of purpose despite their deep differences regarding our schooling. It was not until my siblings and I were adults that we discovered mother's divergence from father on that crucial question. The Akrams, like many secularist members of the old Turkish aristocracy in Alexandria, had deep ties to Kemalism. As for father, his adherence to Sunufi Sufism made him very progressive for a Libyan man of his generation, but his anti-fascist politics were a major issue. And because Zainab and I were officially kept in the dark about his political beliefs, we never suspected that his indignation over our enrollment in Mussolini's school was deeply felt, and that he far preferred homeschooling for us, along with our weekly English lesson at the local book club with a Maltese restaurateur's wife. Much later in life, mother told us she had come to suspect that father secretly resented Zainab and me for our fascist education, even as he presented a united front with her. But in the fevered urgency of those days, there was no room for suspicion. Loyalty prevailed over everything else. It was also out of loyalty that I resigned myself to accepting, abruptly, unconditionally, father's dictum that Zainab was the daughter with personality, while I was the one with stamina. I remember that particular moment in my life quite clearly. It was a moment of waiting, in fear, in hope, of awed expectancy, followed by a nameless pain that I had no choice but to keep to myself, not least because it was nameless. I was about 9, and I had recently asked mother if she would let me accompany Zainab when she went around the quarter to invite the ladies in our neighborhood to mother's tea parties. Zainab's rounds typically took place on Thursday, our off day. "I'll speak to your father about it," she had told me. "He is the one who decides these matters." I learned of the verdict a few days later when I returned from school. I remember approaching our house from the rear lane and through the back court as usual. I opened the door to the patio and saw Auntie Muna drawing water from the well at the opposite end by the stone wall that separated our house from the annex we rented. She put down the bucket when she saw me, walked across the patio toward me, and took my hand, leading me to the fountain at the center. It was winter, and we never ran the fountain in the cold months, so we sat down on the rim of the basin, and I remember gasping and springing up as I felt the sting of the cold marble through my skirt. I wrapped my cape tightly around my thighs and sat back down. She took hold of my hand again, sitting with me in silence for a moment. Looking up into her face, though, I was able to understand everything without any words being exchanged between us. Auntie Muna's expression was as somber as the cold shadows of the walls around us. Her dilated pupils were like 2 discs of onyx in the center of those hazel eyes, and her radiant ivory complexion had deepened to a dull shade of sallow gray. If it weren't for the colorful head wrap, our housekeeper might have been a woman in mourning during that instant of dejected stillness. When she began to speak, her words were ponderous, maybe a bit shy, too, as if she was revealing something personal that she was loath to share with me. Madame Noor has asked me to tell you. Ahmad Basha gave her his decision this morning. Auntie Muna was silent for a moment, still fixing those sad eyes on my face, her hands still folded around mine, her kohl smudging slightly. I know you're disappointed, she resumed, but your father knows your nature so well, Habibti. He's right when he says that outdoor work is good for you. You have a lot of stamina, he said. That's the word he told Madame, stamina. Working with me in the courtyard, he said, helps you get rid of the extra energy, and I'm sure it does. I've seen it work wonders on you, Mariam. Also, Ahmed Basha says working outdoors helps you sleep better when you have those... helps your sleeplessness. I must have looked devastated sitting there under her scrutinizing gaze, my first bitter taste of rejection. She wanted to hold me in her arms, but I shook her off. Leave me alone, I mumbled into her galabia as she tried to pull me closer. I myself was beginning to tear up. I wanted this moment to be over. Auntie Muna had immediately read my mind. Come up with me to the laundry room, she said as she stood up. Come on up to the rooftop. You can read to me from one of your books or look out at the sea. It'll do you a world of good. She went over to pick up the washboard by the kitchen door. Leave your satchel here and let's go, she said, smiling with the washboard under her arm. It's still plenty light out. You can see the new boats pulling into the harbor. You always like looking at the boats. My memory is not entirely clear as to what happened next on the outside stairs. I do recall, however, that Auntie Muna was about 2 stairs ahead of me as we went up. At some point she remembered the bucket she had left by the well. Good Lord, I forgot the bucket, she said, swinging around and slamming the corner of the board so hard into my mouth I staggered sideways and fell back against the banister. The shock was extremely harsh, but it was also very sudden, and I was too confused to feel the pain at first. Then I looked up and saw the grimace of horror on our housekeeper's face, and all at once her dread entered into my entire being, the realization that something had gone terribly wrong. I saw the blood dripping down onto my cape, resting intact for a few seconds on the black woolen fabric, like coral beads. I put my fingers to my mouth, and they came away stained. The next thing I remember is the washboard clattering down the stairs and Auntie Muna on her knees before me, her arms stretched out on either side of me, holding onto the railing, face bent down so close to mine I could catch the scent of frankincense gum on her breath, see the faint streaks of miswak across her immaculate ivory teeth. Please, for the love of God, she implored, tell them you fell in the stairs. I'm done for. If you say I hit you, finished. Awad will kill me. I cannot remember if it was the pain or the sight of Auntie Muna's agony that triggered my tears, but I do know for certain that at some point I just let myself sit back against the banister and cry, trapped between our housekeeper's outstretched arms as her face got closer and closer to mine, bigger and bigger, more and more twisted and tormented. Before long, I began to moan in pain and helplessness and sorrow, as if through the supreme indignity of this final blow, I was now at last free to lament with the full force of my being the bleak sentence that had been handed down by the fountain. I beg you, please say you tripped and fell in the stairs, or Awad will kill me. God will never forgive me for this. I know, but please have mercy on your Auntie Muna. Say you tripped and fell in the stairs. In the name of God, I'll make it up to you, I swear. I'll make up for it 100-fold. I don't know how long I stayed like that, crying, moaning softly with my back against the iron banister, and her tearful, coal-streaked face so close to mine. At some point, though, I held on to a spindle and started to hoist myself up. Standing to her full height, Auntie Muna stepped aside and let me stand up myself and head back to the house, trundling down the stairs alongside me, leaning over me with her arms still protectively held out on either side of my body, as if I might stumble at any moment and fall forward on my face. I was still crying, not so much with pain, perhaps, as with disconsolation, as if this hit had some dark, inscrutable connection with my father's fateful pronouncement. Finally, she had to let me go ahead, walking slightly behind me, still damning herself, still imploring me to say that I had tripped. Ollie was the first to see me. He was in the kitchen, and I remember that he was eating the sandwich we fondly called arusa in those days, a halva wrap. He dropped it and ran out of the room, screaming for Mother. "Ya Allah!" Mother screamed as she saw me. "What happened to you?" "I fell over and hit my mouth," I lied, turning around and looking up at Auntie Muna for confirmation. The smart of my lip wound electric and jarring like a toothache, the lower corner of my mouth smoldering. This is the price I have to pay for telling lies, I thought. And all at once I realized that I was going to have to speak without my lips touching if I wanted to keep from hurting even further. I was going up to the laundry room with Auntie Muna, and I fell face down in the stairs. I will never forget the look of gratitude on her face as the words came out of my torn mouth, clownishly aspirated and guttural. I lied for her sake, out of blind loyalty, and she was so moved that she began to cry again. "I am deeply shaken, madame. It was dreadful seeing my little Mariam hurting." "Let me see your mouth, under the light," Mother said, her eyes still fixed on me with a frown, as if she had difficulty in making sense of my story. We stepped outside the kitchen door into the area we called the foyer, which in our house was not an ordinary entrance hall, but a nameless architectural hybrid placed in a median position between the forbidden space of the men's salon and the huge all-purpose room we called the women's drawing room. That oddly named foyer gave no access to the outer perimeter of our house, a completely hermetic space accessible only through the doors of 3 rooms abutting it, the kitchen and the 2 segregated drawing rooms. There was also the staircase that led up to our bedrooms and a large crystal chandelier hanging over it, the light Mother had in mind. She switched it on and had me sit at the bottom of the stairs. She then asked me to tilt my head back, grasping my chin and pulling down my lower lip with her thumb. You know, I shouted. "Hush up," Mother whispered. "Your sister is sick upstairs, and now you. There'll be a bad bruise on your chin for a while, but your lip, it's nothing." "You split your lower lip slightly. Nothing a strong girl like you couldn't handle. We're going to the infirmary at once. We'll get you stitched up. I'm not a cow, you know." That was what I was trying to say, but with my excessive fear of any bilabial contact, my words came out as an incomprehensible jumble. I repeated. "What?" Mother exclaimed. "You have to stop straining your wound till we get you stitched up, understood?" Hearing those words from Mother, I just could not help it. The retort shot out of me with a force of sarcasm and levity that both scared and excited me. "Never mind, it has been raining all afternoon," I replied, deliberately exaggerating the distortion in my pronunciation. "Never mind, it's been straining all afternoon," was what I both said and not said, taking both solace and pleasure in the realization that I could now use my injury as a secret weapon. Get away with telling her what had been on my mind since Auntie Muna's dreadful revelation at the fountain. Mother just rolled her eyes. She ignored my words and took a step behind me. I turned around with a secret shiver of anticipation. The cuddy-size alcove, wedged between the staircase and the women's drawing room, functioned quite like a miniature walk-in closet. It had a high shelf for our candlesticks and our stock of candles, along with a wall-mounted coat rack underneath it for the coats of the ladies who socialized with us. The shelf was also where her wallet was, a wrist-lit wallet of dark green leather in which she kept some money for immediate daily expenses. She reached up for it, opened it, pulled out a couple of slips and several bills. She took a look at the slips, counted the bills, and put everything in her purse, which could only mean that she was going to accompany me to the infirmary. "You stay right here with my boy," Mother said to Auntie Muna and Antar, when we got to the infirmary, the one opposite Scuola Elementare Media Giovanni Gentile, where my sister and I went. Then the two of us stepped inside the building, and immediately my oversensitive nerves and allergy-prone nose started reacting to the smell of formaldehyde with a violence that made me feel staggered and puny. We had barely walked into the hallway, and I was already overwhelmed by a dread that I had no name for. "Please, Mother," I pleaded. "I'm sick. I can't walk." And I actually began to bury my face between the flaps of her wrap coat, pulling them toward me in a futile attempt to conceal myself from the metallic reek and raw nakedness of this place, its glaringly lit, shockingly white-walled starkness. "Come now, child." Mother stopped and argued with me gently. "If we don't take care of your wound now, your lip will be marked with an ugly scar for the rest of your life. You have to be strong, my darling, and it'll be over in a few minutes. Believe me, Habibti, it's going to be very quick." I was still unresponsive, still holding on to her coat as to a curtain, trying to hide my face. That was when she decided to force me inside. Mother put her arms around my shoulders and quite literally steered me toward the small waiting room, which was empty and had an even stronger alcohol smell than the hallway. "Look at me, child," Mother said as soon as we were seated. "Come now, look at me. You want this to be over, right?" I was leaning sideways in my chair, still holding onto her coat, still sickened by the shock of the place. She cupped my head in her gloved hands and lifted it slowly but strongly until our gazes met, the emerald eyes looking down at me with more sadness than resolve in them, the oval countenance firmly framed by a silver-gray slip-on head wrap, not a single wisp of her honey-blonde hair escaping it. It was the first time in my existence that I found myself studying my mother's appearance with a measure of detachment, and for all the emotionless frigidity of that moment and that space, I could not help but find some form of nameless solace in the sheer beauty of the woman who bore and reared me, the statuesque evenness of her alabaster face, the subtle blush of her cheeks, the wistful lift of her sandy eyebrows. "You want this to be over soon?" she repeated, her tone urgent but not hard, her eyes still sad. "Am I right? Answer me now." "Right, Mother," I said, instinctively realizing that it was in my best interest to tell her what she wanted to hear. "All right, then. There's only one thing you need to do if you want the whole thing done quickly and without pain. As soon as they take you in and ask you to sit down, be sure to keep your eyes closed till they're finished. Promise me you'll do that, Habibti, and everything will be all right. Promise?" Once again, I had to tell Mother what she wanted to hear. I promised, and for a moment felt relieved and not so weak anymore. Then an orderly stepped into the room, and I found myself flashing back to that feeling of frozen fear in the hallway. He was the same mysterious man I would notice every now and then outside the infirmary, a gaunt, chain-smoking, tobacco-skinned Sicilian who wore an outsized lab coat, a precarious comb-over, and bottle-bottom glasses that obscured his gaze and gave him a deceptively sinister air. Most of his body was completely indiscernible under that incongruous white coat. When he saw the horror on my face, the orderly gave me a coffee and tobacco-stained grin, which made me feel even more faint and agitated. He called out to one of the female nurses, an Egyptian name to my relief. "Ratiba," he almost shouted. "That's right, bring in someone really orderly, exactly what I need at this point." I whispered the words in Mother's direction, as coolly and as articulately as possible, even though I was fully aware that my mouth was going to hurt. Mother couldn't help it. She burst into half-suppressed laughter. "You and your bizarre jokes," she exclaimed, trying to sound dismissive and save face in front of the man. The combination of the pleasure taken in that quip and the pain burning in my mouth made me feel heroic all of a sudden, almost elated. And I suddenly realized that bizarre jokes or no, if I could raise a laugh in Mother in this place, I could certainly walk with Ratiba to the dreaded operating room and face my ordeal alone. Back in the waiting room, Mother tipped Ratiba and inspected the stitches, holding my chin between her thumb and index finger, scrutinizing the nurse's craftsmanship with the same critical frown that would darken her face when she supervised our schoolwork at home. "Thank you, Sit Ratiba. How is her wound now?" she asked, looking up at the nurse. "Like it never happened," Ratiba chimed, drawing on a big lump of frankincense gum as she spoke. She handed Mother a vial of iodine and a small box of cotton batting. "They're absorbable sutures, no need to come back. Just don't forget to disinfect it on a regular basis, and no more yawning in class for the next fortnight," she said to me, pinching my cheek with a mischievous smile, a jocular familiarity that Mother was in no mood to tolerate. "My daughter is no yawner, take my word for it. Her trouble is actually allowing herself to sit back and take it easy every now and then. Goodbye, nurse." Out on Piazza Municipio, I felt the full lash of the chill, damp wind, and was all at once thrown back into that fateful moment at the fountain, feeling cut off and forlorn in the raw air. We were walking toward the horse-drawn streetcar, and my somber thoughts must have infected Ali. He trailed behind the four of us with a listless, dejected air. 4 mighty draft horses had just been hitched to the coach, while the outgoing ones stood stone still by the curb in their blankets, their heads lowered against the damp wind. Mother urged us all to get on the streetcar, but my brother stood motionless beside the idle horses, staring into space and frowning, absently grinding his heel into a gap between the cobblestones. We all rushed to his side. "What is it, son?" Mother inquired, bending over him with a tender solicitude she never showed me. All eyes were on Ali now. We stood within arm's reach of the resting horses, and the air was rife with their body heat, the sweet scent of their sweat. "Stupid stairs," he blurted out, still sullen and unmoving, struggling to suppress his tears and put up a tough front. "Ruin my sister's mouth like a busted firecracker." His voice was shaky and tearful. The sight of me bleeding had already deeply unsettled him from the start. Seeing me now with the stitches had unnerved him even further. Ollie was born in early June and wasn't even 13, but he had always seen himself as my older brother and felt deeply protective of me. He was on the verge of tears when he uttered those words, and yet his phrasing was so colorful that none of us women could help it. We all just burst out laughing at his interjection, the stunningly pertinent image of how useless a firecracker could appear once it was busted. In the days that followed, his words proved utterly apt. That sutured lip rendered my whole mouth fragile and unreliable, no matter how sparingly or carefully I tried to use it. "Oh, brother," I told him, "you do so cherish me, don't you?" "Very much," he replied. His voice shook with heartbreaking emotion. "Come now," Mother said, getting emotional herself. "Tomorrow this little accident will be nothing more than a bad memory, my son. Come. Let's treat ourselves to some perugina from Pasticceria Tre Marie. I hear there's nothing better than chocolate to heal anything, especially an injured lip, no matter how busted it is." The horse car, which was designed to resemble an American white bus from the 1920s, was already quite full when we boarded. We had to sit toward the back, in the wooden seat section. The driver kept taking up additional passengers, though, probably more than the vehicle could carry with safety. By the time we rolled out of Piazza Municipio, the windows had begun to fog up, and the air inside the packed carriage became dense, humid, and charged with the rank redolence of damp wool and stale tobacco. Auntie Muna sat in the aisle seat beside me. I swiveled my torso to the right, sliding down and nestling my head in the crook of her arm, the feltish softness of her Berber burnous. I reckoned that if I sat lower and narrowed my field of vision to the wedge of space between her cloaked body and the wooden window frame to my right, I might be able to shut out the stifling presence of the passengers crowded around me, let my gaze wander out to the street. By now the window pane had turned into an unevenly translucent glass plate, misted over with a grainy, discontinuous vapor film that warped and diffused the colors of ordinary street scenes, blurring by as we rattled down Via Bricola. Nebulous, shifting patterns of clustered dots and drops like the frenzied, unfinished work of an impatient spray painter. The driver stopped at the main post office, and I caught myself playing a game, narrowing my eyes and tilting my head slightly, visualizing the wide, neoclassical building at the end of the long, slate-cobbled alley as one of the messy watercolors I would paint, with Mother's awkward help. In my moment of fantasy, the building was metamorphosed into the softly contoured picture of a rain-eroded sandcastle with its twin turrets worn down to gritty nubs. The alley became a path made with licorice squares, the palmetto, agave, and oleander-studded lawn on either side of the path, a foggy jungle growth of scratches and smears in overlapping shades of green and brown and pink. Mother shared the seat ahead of us with Ollie. I stood up when she turned around to speak to Auntie Muna, suddenly feeling I needed to find reassurance in that alabaster face glowing with radiance above the metal frame of the shabby seat. A sad, sentimental urge to be alone with her in our house, to bury my face in the scented shadows of her coat, the protective embrace of her arms. But in that moment she was all business again, her eyes remote and dark and hard, as I sat and looked up at her with all my emptiness and nameless longing. She held out a rectangular white envelope through the loop of the metal headrest. "I want you to go to Dartuta," she said to Auntie Muna, "and hand the letter back to Monsieur Freiburg's secretary. Tell her Ahmad Basha has read it and has charged you to inform the boss that there is no need for a letter of recommendation. Monsieur Freiburg's word is all he needs in terms of guarantee. We will vacate the annex as soon as he, Mr. Freiburg, tells us the tenants are ready to move in. I also want you to go to Niki Foraki's. Ahmad Basha's travel permit photos are ready. Here's the receipt. We'll wait for you around Piazza Cagni." The streetcar stopped at Market Square. Auntie Muna stood up, and Antar sat down in her place. I slid off the wooden seat and inched over to the window, resting my right forearm on its lower frame. I wiped away the condensation with the heel of my left hand. The full-sized orange trees that marked off the red brick court of our outdoor market stood as radiant as ever in their wooden planter boxes. Their immaculate leaves were treated with leaf shine as usual, and the navel oranges glowed like lanterns in the blue-green foliage. Beyond those neatly spaced planters, there was the customary motley scene of our market. Dazzling arrays of roses and flowers in florist stands, and the most amazing fruits and vegetables artfully arranged in the stalls and on the carts, their colors glistening, beckoning in the distance like the hypnotic hues of exotic porcelain novelties. I saw her dark cloaked form spring off the running board and merge into the crowd of market shoppers, the only burnoosed woman on the sidewalk, her perfect Nefertitian face glowing like ivory inside the black hood. We pulled out, and I kept following Auntie Muna with my eyes, observing our housekeeper work her way through the throng toward the Moorish arcade that housed the mall, known among Benghazians by the rather exotic name of the Indian Bazaar, a cluster of shops that contrasted dramatically with Souk al-Dalam, their echoes of faraway mythical lands and dreamy experiences. Monsieur Freiburg's establishment, Dartuta, was the first and most prominent shop in the Indian Bazaar. In fact, it was considered the finest fancy goods store in our city. Its owner, we knew him only as Monsieur Freiburg, was a French Jewish gentleman whose parents migrated to Tunisia when he was very young. He spoke French, Italian, and Tunisian Judeo-Arabic. The shop was named after his daughter Deborah, who was my classmate and went by the nickname Tuta. Father conducted all his local banking affairs with Monsieur Freiburg, shunning Mussolini's banks altogether. In those days, all business transactions in Benghazi involved cash payments, and father, like any other important businessman in town, had to have adequate liquidity resources at all times. The gentleman from France made that possible in a speedy, efficient manner and at rates that were more competitive than those charged by the local banks. Auntie Muna went through the portico on the market side of the bazaar and into a side door. We proceeded down the roofed section of Via Bricola, past Dartuta's breathtaking main entrance, the hand-carved arabesques of its Moroccan archway, the amber glow of its twin copper-encased Andalusian lamps hanging over the door from their iron chains. Soon we would enter Via Torino, instants away from the splendors of Piazza Cagni. We got off at Palazzo Prosdocimo, a monumental Art Deco department store on the piazza. Since we were not going into any of the shops, Mother and I crossed over to the roundabout in the middle of the square, our only shelter from the dust kicked up by passing traffic. It was not much of either, but my nasal symptoms were definitely a matter of concern to Mother, who did not want me itching and sneezing and complaining about how unbearable the very idea of dust was. Those were the mid-30s, and Piazza Cagni had not yet been paved. Plain red Benghazi dirt with fine and volatile dust stirred up by the slightest breeze, finding its way into your nose, settling on your clothes and on your face. Our convenient haven in the middle of the street junction was a monumental disk of concrete circling a low turf-covered mound with a majestic Sicilian fir at its center. Mother and I headed straight for that inner island of grass and waited on Ollie and Antar, who had been dispatched to buy the chocolate from Pasticceria Tre Marie opposite Prosdocimo. There was only a trickle of traffic around us, the occasional truck or car, a few buggies and bicycles coming and going. But somehow we both knew that in my present mood I needed to feel protected. The best way for me to find protection, we tacitly agreed, was to wait on that impeccably groomed lawn. And I did indeed feel safe and sheltered, standing in the shadow of the pine tree, my spirits unexpectedly lifting even as the sky had shifted. We had not been there more than a few minutes when the sun broke out from behind the clouds, just as it began to slip below the roofline of Palazzo Prosdocimo. The metamorphic amber glow of that lowering sun had suddenly transmogrified the entire east side of the square, muted its daunting architectural grandeur into a chiaroscuro scene of enchantment. Our Art Deco municipal theater, the marmoreal monumentalism of its ice-white rectangular plains and its blind arcade of stilted arches shifting to a grisaille of dark ginger root and burnt umber, the imposing sandstone facade of the Military Association, pilasters receding into the shadows like half-melted wax tablets, the avenue of slender palm trees along Viale della Stazione, stretching out to the eastern horizon in soft, paper-cut silhouette, all of it already fading as fast as a chimera, thanks to the treacherous transience of our desert afterglow. I do not remember at what precise moment the Tuareg seer spotted us, but I certainly recall her husband's voice and how Mother and I turned around at the eerie, muffled sound of it. "Markunda!" he yelled, and went on shouting at her in Berber. "Stay right there, I won't be long," she shouted back in a strange Maghrebi Arabic dialect, not from around these parts, and not from east of here either. Probably Algeria. We stood firmly within the protective perimeter of our green island, staring at them in amazement. The man was leading 2 gigantic camels. The one he held in rein was burden-free and elegantly saddled, while the other looked overloaded and had its rope halter tied to the backrest of the lead animal's seat. It appeared that those monumental ships of the desert had crossed over from the Prosdocimo edge of the square, just like us, and their human leader was now hovering miserably around Mother and me, protesting as his wife commenced to approach us. She had already stepped onto the concrete ring of the roundabout, leaving her husband decidedly behind her as if he was a burden or an embarrassment. And so he came to a halt, just a few steps from the circular structure, with his face all but invisible within the folds of his litham. The hood of his burnous was pulled down low, which made his voice sound remote and cavernous. "Come back here, woman," he moaned, in Arabic dialect this time, even as a Fiat truck came roaring around in a cloud of dust, nearly grazing the second beast's rump. The driver was in no rush to move on, though, hitting the brakes unnecessarily well after he had cleared that poor underdog camel. He leaned on his horn and out of the window, taking his time to hurl an elaborate insult at the stranded stranger. While a visibly serene Marcunda walked on toward us, unperturbed by the Italian's arbitrary display of machismo, a broad smile on a face that did not betray any hint of the strain of desert travel, her immaculate teeth flashing like chalk between freshly painted dark purple lips. She wore the traditional indigo turban deliberately loose to show off her pleasing countenance, her raven hair, and the marvelous Tuareg cross earrings she had on. The seer had now crossed all the way over to our grassy little haven and was standing right before us. Marcunda's eyes were the first thing I noticed as I studied her face. The aquamarine luminescence of those eyes made a contrast with the copper glow of her flushed cheeks that was ineffably compelling, haunting beyond words. Suddenly, all of this seemed so beautifully unreal, the otherworldly garb and ravishingly rakish demeanor of this strange woman who had materialized from nothingness, just like our chance intimation of spring in the dead of winter. There were now 3 of us, as Mother and I clung to the last rays of the sun, sharing our haven of lush lawn and crisp, pine-scented air with Marcunda, her endless eyes and irresistible smile, her bizarre offer to talk to me about what she called the path of my destiny. "I was just passing through here. I could have kept going, but I saw you were hurt, and I knew I had to stop and talk to you about the path of your destiny. Fate has made our paths cross. It has put me in your way so that I can help you understand the meaning of what happened to you today." She had now switched to standard Arabic, awkwardly eloquent and imperfect, but fully understandable, notwithstanding the staccato cadence of her Algerian accent. We stood facing east, and the twilight sky was like the mottled hollow of a clay oven. The dead still palms like raven feathers on charred sticks. "Look," she said, and waved her hand, encompassing the horizon. "The wind has quieted, and the sun, even the sun, is giving you a sign. It's telling you how many beautiful things life has in store for you in spite of the injury and all the grief. Listen, I am a seer, and I can help you with my powers. Let me tell you what I see, and then I'll give you something that you will keep with you at all times. It will protect you day and night." Mother was suspicious and dismissive. "My good woman," she interjected, "we're just like you, strange as it may seem, passing through. No time for fate and signs and all that. Just get back to your husband and leave my daughter alone. Keep to your path and make sure you always introduce yourself as a fortune teller. It'll sell better." I very much wanted Marcunda to read my fortune, though, and I wished the woman would stand fast. But Ali and Antar had emerged from the pastry shop and put a stop to my wishful wonderings. They stood under the marquee laughing and trying to stuff their mouths with what looked like chunks of pinkish pastry, tossing their heads back with every bite so that they wouldn't miss a single crumb of whatever it was they were eating, a patently ineffective approach, judging from the crumb scatterings on the breasts of their coats. Ali was laughing so hard he staggered backward against the marquee post, still tilting his head back in a vain attempt to keep the crumbs from landing onto his coat. "Ya Allah, he's going to choke right before my eyes, as if I haven't had enough turmoil for today." Don't you worry, madame, I'll get them. Auntie Muna was just about to join us, but instead she hopped off the roundabout and headed straight across the junction toward the marquee under which my brother and her son stood, unaware of being observed, trying to brush off all evidence of their surreptitious purchase and doing a miserable job of it. Meanwhile, the lead camel, having somehow managed to edge its way onto the roundabout behind its master's back, began to put its size and the astonishing length of its neck to excellent use. With its hind legs half folded and its forelegs lowered onto the concrete surface, it bent its head down, stretched its neck as far out as it could, and commenced to sample the lawn on which we stood, raising its head critically after the first few bites, chewing the grass of our finest roundabout, even as its followers stayed put on the other side, looking as forlorn and left out as the scorned husband. Inevitably, the Tuareg man felt a tug on the rein and turned around. Seeing what was happening, he had no choice but to step onto the concrete ring and rush toward the beast, trying to dissuade it, cursing his fate in Maghrebi Arabic, mumbling something about the Sudanese watchman, an Eritrean carabinieri standing guard by his candy-striped sentry box outside the Military Association building. "Give them some carob," she ordered her husband. "That'll keep them from getting into trouble with the soldier. Chomping on the Italian's fancy grass. Nobody is going to like that here. Certainly not him over there." "Their grass," Mother shouted. But before she could launch into a political lecture on Libya being our country and everything in it being ours, the carabinieri came striding across the junction, rifle ominously unslung, and stood squarely facing the terrified Tuareg. Outside the pastry shop, the rest of our party stood on the edge of the sidewalk, petrified with fear and surprise, eyes riveted on our surreal scene. The Eritrean carabinieri addressed his vis-a-vis in awkward, strongly guttural Hijazi Arabic, which made the words tumbling out of his mouth even more threatening and peremptory. "This camel stays away from the lawn once and for all, that, or he will be shot." But then Markunda, who had already anticipated the confrontation without us even noticing, had managed to bring forth 2 feed bags from the loaded camel, holding them up with a broad smile and a prestidigitator's panache. Not only was she unfazed by the brutal show of force, she was clearly having her fun. "Carubo, signore," she exclaimed in awful Italian. "Carubo, per favore. Bono camile, per favore. Tutto bene." "Carubo," he corrected her with an expression of amazement and immitigable disgust on his face, failing to acknowledge the humor in the seer's deliberate shift from Arabic to Italian. Her satiric gesture was not lost on Mother, though. As soon as the officer was gone, she turned to face Markunda with a smile. The "my good woman" condescension of a moment ago had now given way to solidarity, and so was the outrage at our 2 boys' pastry shenanigans. Mother said, "I was going to dismiss you out of hand just then, but seeing how this lout treated you and the rest of us, camels included, I will stand my ground right here, and we will take our time and have you read my daughter's fortune. We will eat the chocolate right here just to spite that no-good, boorish occupier." "Amen to that," Markunda exclaimed. The reading did not last more than 10 to 15 minutes, and yet Markunda was able to put her finger on some of the most crucial things my inner world revolved around. The inexplicable sensitivities, the middle-of-the-night onslaughts of unruly ideas and unrelenting mental energy, the sudden clouds of anxiety and underachievement guilt. I remember her examining me with those uncanny eyes in all their mesmerizing, unearthly beauty. Markunda punctuated her prophecy with beautifully choreographed serpentine hand movements that made the silver bangles on her left wrist tinkle like glass chimes. "My rare gifts," she said, "would come with great challenges and fears, But by and by, I was bound to triumph over all those hurdles, go on to do things no girl had ever done before. "You wake up in the middle of the night, Mariam," she said. "Many a night, full of trepidation and longing. You see very far and hope and pray for all the things you see. Despite your unusual height and physical strength, the longings in your heart are far greater than the power of your body, child. But your body will catch up, and then you will do the things you are destined to do, deeds the world will marvel to behold. You will travel far, and the work of your hands will surpass all human imaginings." Markunda suddenly fell silent, lifted up her right hand, and contemplated it for the briefest second. She then worked a luminous rosary off her wrist and let it slide down into the hollow of her upturned palm, its beads throbbing with an opalescent glow. "Mariam," she declared as she held out the gift for me, "with this blessed rosary by your bedside, you need never fear waking in the middle of the night. Reach for it every time your heart wakes in the cold darkness, and you will find it to be comforting and reliable. Hold it in your right palm and keep gazing at it in the dark as you recite these words that I am about to give you." I took her gift with my right hand. The seer glanced to her left, then her right. Seeing that there were no adult males around except for her husband, she pulled down her turban and, reaching behind her head, lifted up a dark brown deerskin pouch she was wearing on a leather string around her neck. Unlacing the drawstring of the pouch, she pulled out a wafer-thin, oddly luminescent yellowish thing that looked like a jagged shard of honeycomb or shale. She kept the object on the flat of her right palm and held it out for me to see. It was an age-old piece of thick paper inscribed with very fine Kufic letters written in carbon ink and arranged in the shape of a labyrinthine seal. "This is the greatest safeguard of all," she sighed, perhaps with a hint of regret. "The verse of the throne. During the day you will wear it on your breast like a shield. It's from my grandmother, and now it's yours. Keep it in its pouch at all times. It will protect you, day and night." Night had all but descended. It was time to go. Mother had paid Markunda, and the seer and her husband had vanished from our life as swiftly and chimerically as they had entered it. The pouch with the blessed Quranic verse dangling from my neck, the magical rosary in my coat pocket. We headed for the tall reddish lantern that marked the streetcar stop as the facade of Prozdocimo became ablaze with its multicolored web of light strings winking on and off, a luminescent gingerbread house with its amber glow display windows like stage sets just before curtain up. "Listen," I whispered to Ali just before we went into the bus. "What were you eating back there outside the pastry shop?" "Oh, something very special." "Tell me, what was it?" "It's made with a special berry." "Strawberry, of course." "No, stupid. If it was strawberry, I would have told you. It's a special berry from Europe, and you have never eaten it." "You were eating pastry with a special berry?" "It's not a pastry, simpleton. It's a sort of puffy candy. Meringue. That's what they call it. It's French." "What?" I have never ceased to wonder, why was it so important for me to accompany my sister on her Thursday rounds? Why did I choose to immure myself in mutism, never pleading with Mother, never protesting? Loyalty, again, along with the feeling, deeply seated in our collective imagination, that we all lived in hard and trying times, cruel times of pervasive precariousness that were relentlessly testing our strength and endurance, both as individuals and as a family. times that were always threatening to destroy our livelihood, nullify our prosperity. And so with that awareness hanging over our heads like a sinister cloud, we accepted, as a matter of course, that we should never take our wealth for granted, finding assurance and order in the work structure set up by our Father, the tasks that were essential for our survival as an economic entity, and that were somehow made inseparable from our existential stability as a family unit. In those days, sales volume at the Whale was not solely dependent on the foreign goods that came in through the port of Benghazi. In fact, that segment of our business didn't carry a wide profit margin. The products my father and brothers brought into Libya from their grueling trade trips to Egypt and Sudan were far more profitable, cross-border imports that allowed the company to maintain its competitive edge, along with its capacity to offer a wide variety of the low profit margin imports we carried in stock at the wholesale store and in Uncle Ibrahim's spice and herb shop. Several times a year, the three Khaldoon men would lead a caravan of 6 to 8 trucks on a trek, during which they took the most arcane roundabout itineraries, making the most out-of-the-way stops en route to Alexandria, an obscure network of back roads and rural communities in the desert that only their Tuareg guide knew. They were recognizable in every oasis, every town, and every hamlet along the way, never failing to stop in and do business with the locals, no matter how small their population. But those trips were not risk-free, even in the early 30s. The men who crewed on the caravan had to be more than astute traveling salesmen. They were natural risk-takers, willing to accept the fact that carrying pistols and rifles and eventually using them against urban robbers and Bedouin bandit gangs was a normal part of their job. An Italian army connection in Benghazi took care of all permits and travel documents. In Alexandria, it was Uncle Karim who handled the paperwork and kept Egyptian and Sudanese officials happy. Among the products my father and my 2 brothers brought in from Egypt and Sudan, gold, jewelry, textiles, makeup, and foundation garments were the goods with the highest profit margins. Every member of our household was expected to perform at least one important task that revolved around those imports. Mother and Zainab's function was to put together tea parties in the women's drawing room for the prominent ladies of Benghazi and its environs, presenting the wedding jewelry, dowry gold coins, accessories, perfumes, and makeup imported by our men. During those precious klatches, effectively advertising showcases, we served coffee, tea, and Levantine ice creams and pastries catered by Auntie Fatima, the Algerian wife of our local Lebanese pastry chef. We also served Italian chocolates and candies that Ali would fetch from Pasticceria Tre Marie. As for me, my main task consisted in working with Auntie Muna and Antar during those Thursdays that were so crucial to the company's success. Thursday was known among us women as Fabric Day, an exceptional and noisy happening in our house, a day during which, except for Antar's participation, the front yard was metamorphosed into exclusively female territory, a frenzied working space where the textiles that were brought in from Egypt would go through the final stage of processing before they were trucked to Benghazi's retailers. The imported fabrics came in tied bundles of neatly folded fat quarters. A typical bundle contained 10 squares of material, 18 by 22 inches each. Every time the returning caravan rolled into Benghazi, those bundles were immediately taken to the Moroccan tannery on Sidi Salem Alley, across from our home. There they were dyed, fixated, and processed in special vats exclusively reserved for the transformation of our fabrics. Pressing each individual square of fabric was the last stage in the process, and it was done in our front courtyard by half a dozen professional ironers under Auntie Muna's supervision and mine. Preparations for that day's work started early in the morning. After the men had left for work, Auntie Muna and Antar would begin by putting out cloth-covered trestle tables on the cobbled end of the men's courtyard between the gate and the outer door of the men's salon. Then our housekeeper would light the brazier for the ironers who would show up later with their flat irons. On fabric day, my job consisted in observing the court and liaising between mother and the workers. I was also in charge of supervising Antar as he conveyed the material from the Sidi Salem tannery to the ironers. Equipped with a wheelbarrow, we would both go out through the men's gate to the tannery, where he would load up some of the processed fabric, wheel it back to our house, and pile it in a huge box next to the trestle tables. The ironers would then proceed to press the material, fold it, and stack it in perfectly tied 10-square bundles. Considering the large quantity of fabric imported by our men, working with the ironers on any given Thursday involved a lot of shuttling back and forth between our house and the Moroccan tannery. The Thursday workers were paid by mother in person, and Auntie Muna took care of all their needs, which included a house-provided lunch and 2 tea breaks with candy and pastries from the Lebanese pastry store. The lunch was brought in from the next-door European-style restaurant, which was owned and managed by a Maltese chef. The ironers were always very jovial when they ate, making jokes about the food being man-cooking. Looking back on those Thursdays and their unspoken implications, I tend to think they ultimately allowed us to imagine that we were happy in spite of everything, safe in our shared conviction that if we were feeling happy, it was because we were united under a compact of unfailing family loyalty, protecting us against the forces of enmity and unpatriotic betrayal raging around us. Then all of a sudden, Mussolini, the real flesh and blood man, came along, and everything about that compact changed, or so the story went, the secret mythical story told by mother within our family. In the tale, our father's destiny was sealed the day the fascist tyrant came into town, as if the entire fabric of his existence had come undone through the fated force of that one single day in 1937. In fact, hatred of the fascists and a certain powerless rage against their governor-general in Tripoli had been festering within our father since the 20s, years during which he and Uncle Ibrahim were secretly involved in an increasingly brutalized resistance while still maintaining local political influence. Even as he mounted wave after wave of police and military brutality, the Governor-General of Libya began studying the possibility of neutralizing that influence through a more subtle political strategy. Starting in the early 30s, the fascist ruler, who was well aware that the Mahdi and Khaldoun families were the most powerful funders of the resistance, commenced to lure a few regional Bedouin chieftains with promises of prestige and extended powers for them, prosperity for the Benghazians as a whole, and even a measure of political autonomy for the region. The gambit worked with devastating efficiency. Through long-distance political maneuvering from Tripoli, the Governor-General managed to provoke a ruthless feeding frenzy among local tribal and community leaders, resulting in further weakening of the resistance in our city and the ouster of Uncle Ibrahim from his position as unofficial mayor of Benghazi. This reversal was a terrible blow to both our families. Although Uncle Ibrahim never lost his prestige and epic stature among Benghazians, and father's image as a prominent community leader remained intact, the two men had become, in political terms, purely symbolic figures. Even so, the terribly adverse political circumstances never quite managed to squelch their revolutionary ardor. Both uncle and nephew remained faithful to the tradition of Omar Mukhtar well into the 30s, when the political winds had definitively changed. Steadfastly, quixotically, both men also remained staunch financial supporters of the resistance, as much out of rage and injured pride as out of a sense of obligation to the memory of the Lion of the Desert. They never reneged on their patriotic commitment to the hero's anti-fascist creed, living in hopeful expectation of the end of their struggles, dreaming of the day when Libya would rid itself of Mussolini's gang, as the fascists were called in their circle. Patriotic commitment or no, however, history was decidedly not on the two men's side in the unsettled political climate of the 30s. By the time Mussolini rode into town to promote his new vision for Libya, the preparatory groundwork had already been laid by the so-called Bedouin upstarts. And that was what hurt our father's pride most. Through the wholehearted support of a minority of shamelessly opportunistic natives, Libya was well on its way to becoming the fourth shore of Italy. The Gioventù Araba del Littorio had been founded, effectively making a number of young Benghazian nobodies members of the fascist party. And in school, we were now being indoctrinated with the utopian illusion of us becoming special Italian citizens in the very near future. So when all is said and done, when all the chaotic experiences of that period are put into perspective, the mythical notion that it was the visit of the monstrous Duce that broke our father's heart does not seem to hold up under objective scrutiny. It was all those years of successive defeats and brazen betrayals that destroyed his faith in humankind, creating a sustained buildup of bleak negativity that kept seething in his sensitive heart. That fateful day in the spring of 1937 was at most a trigger event that sent him tumbling to the depths of depression. Still, the aura of a family myth has a comforting appeal that is hard to resist, especially during childhood and early youth, because ultimately Mother's story was precisely that for us, her children. A therapeutically pacifying myth that allowed us to see our father's death in soothingly simple terms as the tragic but heroic outcome of a clear-cut division between the forces of good and the forces of evil, between a happy world before the Duce's visit and a gloomy one after it. In short, our family myth of Mussolini allowed us to infuse the nightmare of the times with a measure of sense and congruity. It made it possible for us to abate the baffling shock of history's untimely intrusion into our father's life. The earth-shattering moment narrated to us by Uncle Ibrahim, a good man collapsed on a bag of Ethiopian coffee, gone beyond recall in one of the dark, dank chambers of the whale, his fez fallen to the dirt floor. The Duce's visit. It was first brought into my young and precocious consciousness through our teacher's hyperbolic accounts at Scuola Elementare Media Giovanni Gentile. Early on in the winter term, we were informed that the event was slated for the spring of 1937. Even so, we ended up spending most of the term learning about it and preparing for it, with the rhetoric of our teachers growing more intense as the fateful date approached. On the eve of the big day, during our first morning class, the history and geography teacher, Signorina Cordini, announced to us playfully but emotionally that the time had come for her to reveal some of the details of the visit. She told us that Mussolini's motorcade was going to parade through our city early tomorrow morning, through Via Balbia, the newly inaugurated military highway. After a brief inspection of the Mussolini promenade, the Duce would be presented with an Arabian charger in a private ceremony led by a group of regional chieftains. That welcome gift from the Cyrenian sages, as she called them, was among the more colorful visit-related facts we learned from Signorina Cordini, who inflicted on us an impassioned relation of the meeting's historic significance. During tomorrow's service, we were told, the Duce would show our regional chieftains the ceremonial Sword of Islam that he had received in Tripoli, thereby requesting to assume his title as Protector of Islam in Benghazi too. After the chieftain's endorsement, he would ride into town on his Arabian stallion, a benevolent guardian of the city and its Islamic heritage and traditions. Finally, our teacher concluded with the most exhilarating revelation of all, proudly informing us that there was a rally scheduled for tomorrow morning on Piazza del Municipio and that we were all attending, as spectators only, since we were an all-Libyan school. There was even a small viewing stand by the mosque set up especially for Scuola Elementare Media Giovanni Gentile. We spent the remainder of that school day rehearsing their fascist songs and slogans and doing drill exercises in Italian history and geography, reciting ceaselessly, collectively, their hollow dates and phrases and places, their ghostly political liturgy on the advent of fascism and its liberating role in Italy and Libya alike. Shortly before dismissal, our teachers asked us to file quietly out of the classrooms and assemble in the schoolyard, where our principal, Signora Taramelli, spoke to us from a raised platform about something that left us all dumbfounded. The Duce's visit to our school tomorrow after the rally. It was going to be not only a very special day for Benghazi, she proclaimed, but also a very, very special day for Scuola Elementare Media Giovanni Gentile. From our outstanding institution, 2 exceptional pupils had been chosen to welcome the Duce here on this recess yard in the name of the entire school. I heard her mention my sister's name and mine. Then she went on to provide additional details about tomorrow's schedule of activities and the meeting place where we were to wait for our teachers before heading out to Piazza del Municipio. When our principal was done addressing us, she stepped off the platform and walked up to my sister, telling her to remain on the school grounds. Our fellow pupils, who had begun to disband, were still reeling in disbelief, chattering excitedly about tomorrow. Signora Taramelli was an imposingly tall, athletic woman in her early 30s who always wore her silky blue-black hair in a short, inverted bob with straight, pointy side bangs. When she addressed us pupils, her attitude was usually rather respectful, almost warm. But there was a decidedly daunting quality in the unflinching placidity, the unruffled depth of those steel blue eyes. That and the Celtic toughness of her high cheekbones and angular jawline gave her an appearance of severity that probably belied a tender disposition. In preparation for tomorrow, she wore a full MVSN uniform, white shirt, black tie, black jacket, and skirt. Her head was topped with a 2 large black garrison cap emblazoned with the Italian fasces and the gold fascist eagle. Untypically, she addressed us in a machine-gun-like staccato tone, and we both kept staring in stupefaction at her muscular self, so suddenly and outlandishly metamorphosed into a soldier, barking out orders like an automaton. The ravishingly soft hair of our principal, ordinarily one of her most striking features, was lost in the stark, lusterless blackness of the martial cap, which, besides its glaringly unnatural and unbecoming appearance, seemed so uncanny and contrived, as if it was something she had borrowed from a man in a rash, hapless attempt to hide some deficiency in her person. "You mind your teachers tomorrow morning," she snapped. "Mariam will mind Signorina Cordini. Zainab will stay near Signora Cabrini. They will tell you what to do. Listen carefully and do not deviate from their instructions. Everything will work out fine. It's going to be a glorious day for our city and for our school." Our teachers stood at attention behind her, all of them looking tense and somewhat angry. They were probably just worn out and horrifically nervous. On our way back home with Antar, I talked to my sister about tomorrow. "Why was Signora Taramelli so upset when she told us to mind the teachers?" I asked. "She wasn't upset," Zainab replied impatiently. It's the overbite. Sometimes it makes her upper teeth clamp down on her lower lip as if she's mad. She's very nice, though, don't worry. I'm not worried, I said. The next morning, we sat down to breakfast as usual, which was always just the two of us girls and Antar. Our men always breakfasted shortly after morning prayer, leaving for the wholesale store as soon as they had finished their meal. Antar was in charge of escorting us to school and back. He had his father's build, and at 13 was already as tall as a man and almost as strong. He ate like a man too, and we enjoyed letting him help us finish our food, slipping some of it onto his plate and watching him gobble up the evidence in a few wolfish bites. We had Egyptian breakfast every morning, and so for our escort, the fare wasn't at all different from what his mother served in their home: fava beans, hard-boiled eggs, Egyptian falafel, and cheese served in a plate with olives and a drizzle of olive oil. Today, Zainab and I managed to start our morning in quiet indifference, trying to be oblivious to yesterday's shrill conversation with Mother, trying to be oblivious to the much ballyhooed event. We stared sleepily into our plates and half ate our food, and for a moment our breakfast went on being just another ordinary, sluggish, school day ritual, until Mother finally broke her silence. She said, "Your father didn't sleep a wink last night, you know that? He was still in his work clothes, poor man, when he made ablution for the dawn prayer. I haven't seen him this upset since the day Uncle Ibrahim was ousted. He told me you two had been chosen on purpose. They did it to spite and mock him, the judicial authority. Those thugs plotted it with the MVSN. That's what your father said. May Benghazi be his last destination, this heartless, murderous butcher." She motioned Auntie Muna to bring our school uniforms and coats. "Which way will you be going?" she snapped as we stood up. The question wasn't banal, a deliberate, terrible reminder of our conversation yesterday evening and Mother's burst of temper when we had told her about the uncustomary meeting place where we were to wait for our teachers. "Mother, really, it's no big deal," Zainab said, speaking for both of us. "I know where we're going from the moment we step out of the women's gate. All we have to do is take a right at the end of Sabir Alley and head toward Marsa Street instead of the usual route. Then we'll cross our street, Mahdi, and head straight for the fish market. That's it. Ali showed us the spot yesterday. On our way to the piazza, we'll be walking right by our house and up Sidi Salem, past Uncle Ibrahim's shop." "It's all very simple, Mother. I know the way perfectly, from the women's gate to the meeting place." The women's gate. It was embedded, quietly, obscurely, in the stone wall of the back court on the Sabir Alley side. Except on Thursdays, the men's end of our home, the Mahdi Street side, was forbidden territory for us women, from the front gate and court to the vestibule and the men's salon. Mother's aggravation and Zainab's frantic reassurances were understandable. My sister and I always had strict instructions to take the same route and never deviate from it. We were both fair-skinned and often mistaken for Italians. Our parents constantly dreaded acts of harassment or violence. Hence Antar's protective ministrations and the unchanging route and routine, which started with the three of us going out through the back of the house, the kitchen and patio side, the women's gate side, that diminutive, unpainted eyesore of a gate, studded with rusty nails that bled onto the weathered wood, our inglorious egress into Sabir Alley and the flux of the real world. From Sabir, we would direct ourselves towards Sidi Salem Alley, take a right turn there, and head south, in the direction of Atik Mosque. At the top of Sidi Salem, we would turn right on Zarug Alley, where our school was, nestled around a walled courtyard opposite the infirmary and a madrasa. While strategic Zarug was the unofficial dividing line between the north and south ends of Benghazi's historic district, that corner location of Scuola Elementare e Media Giovanni Gentile marked the start of the East End, where the mesmerizing shops of Souk al-Dalam beckoned. with the eastern half of Zaruk meandering through the motley labyrinths of our historic business district all the way down to Piazza Fonduc. But today was going to be different, and Mother was furious. We were to join our schoolmates and teachers by the fish market, and there was going to be a change in the initial part of our route. We had to explain, or probably justify, the switch, even though we had told Mother everything yesterday right after school. It was unusual for her to be cranky and strident, but the sleepless night had left her irritable. "Damn these people," she yelled. "Don't worry, Mother, it's all very simple, really." "Well, no matter how simple it is, Antar will walk you to the fish market just the same, and wait with you till your teachers show their faces. These thugs have been nothing but trouble from the day they set foot in our country, asking our young ones to go to the fish market on a school day. It's not really the fish." "Enough quibbling." We put on our uniforms and coats, kissed our mother's forehead, and said goodbye to Auntie Muna. My sister and I walked silently toward the designated meeting place, each of us lost in her own inexpressible thoughts. We had never even suspected the extent to which our parents and the older members of our family were agitated by this sudden turn of events. As far as I was concerned, and although from the outset I had a few qualms about taking today's unusual route, the Duce's visit was just another day at school, and even later when I found myself on the high end of Piazza Municipio with Signorina Cordini by my side, standing in the first row on that viewing platform, the child in me failed to realize how momentous the day was for the Italians, how high the stakes for everyone involved. Soon we joined our teachers and classmates as planned by the beverage booth opposite the fish market. Those of us who were given permission by their parents to attend stood there in the balmy sunshine and waited for Signora Taramelli, some 30 schoolgirls, impeccably groomed and uniformed, bundled up in our superfluous coats, noisily curious and excited about this unexpected change in our routine. The 4 civilian-clad teachers who were in charge of us stood apart. They were silent and looked tense and broody. Eventually, our principal showed up in a topless command car, black uniformed and stunningly made up, next to an Alpini officer with a black raven feather in his forage cap. He pulled his car halfway up onto the curbed European-style sidewalk, and she stood up and turned around instantly, looking at no one in particular, facing us once again from an elevated position with that ill-fitting garrison cap and that borrowed soldier's expression, her left hand gripping the molding of the windshield frame and her right raised in Roman salute. The teachers returned her greeting with mechanical symmetry, including Mrs. Aswani, who taught us Arabic. Then, without one word spoken, she sat back down in the passenger seat, and the two of them drove on toward Marsa Street, heading south in the direction of Piazza Municipio. Our teachers now ordered us to form a column of 2s, and we commenced to walk down Maudi Street until we reached the north wall of our house. We entered the north end of our historic district through the Turkish gate of Sidi Salem, with its impressive colonies of house sparrows nesting cleverly beneath the roof of the quarter, in the space between the gate arch and the eaves. The modern asphalt and roomy sidewalk of Maudi Street gave way to the brick pavement and shadowy roofed alleys of the old city. The Italian teachers were now treading on alien territory, their familiarity with our quarter being limited to the highly visible, well-guarded stretch between Piazza Municipio and the school on Zarug. To my sister and me, however, this was our neighborhood, and as we marched into Salem Alley, I could hear Zainab farther down the column behind me, already bragging, either to her maid or Signora Cabrini, her custodian for the day. The first whitewashed wall coming up on your right, you can't see much behind it, but that's the east wall of our house. The Moorish door next is ours too. It's an annex for our tenants, Mr. Sanz and his wife. He's an Andalusian shoemaker from Tunisia. They're going to move in next year. The closed door after that is going to be Mr. Sanz's shop. The restaurant to our left is Maltese, European, you know, but they can cook excellent Lebanese food for us. You just have to order it one day in advance. The big archway right next to it, that's a Moroccan tannery. Thank God they keep all their stinky vats way back in the courtyard. The big shop to our right with the spice bags, my uncle, Uncle Ibrahim. He has the best spices and the best honeys. Uncle Ibrahim. I saw him right there outside his spice and herb shop as we began to make our way up the alley amid the sweetly confusing aromas of Sidi Salem's north end, a redolence of European cooking overlapping with the spice scents and attars that wafted out of our uncle's shop. But something was deeply wrong with Uncle Ibrahim today. His expression was altered and strange, arms akimbo, feet firmly planted on the tiny sidewalk, as if he had been expecting this moment all along, waiting in a state of simmering anticipatory anger for hours. That morning was the first time I had ever seen him enraged, and without his inseparable burgundy fez, which he always wore at a jaunty, flirtatious angle. In my memory, our uncle's diminutive height and pencil mustachioed appearance were permanently linked to a certain attitude of childlike cheer and clever playfulness. His face was endearingly ageless and moon-shaped, with those round, tortoise-shell glasses only accentuating the cherubic chubbiness of his countenance. His otherworldly, dreamy eyes. In that instant, though, there were none of those familiar qualities in him, and I was once again baffled, failing to comprehend the intense, troubled emotions of an adult. This alien look on Uncle Ibrahim's face. For me, the expression of his eyes had always been a mark of warm indulgence and boyish humorousness, but today those eyes seemed impenetrably hard or angry or desperate as he stood between the bags of spices neatly heaped and displayed on the wooden racks that flanked the doorstep of his shop. Stiff and on his guard in work clothes, the traditional waist-length tunic and shalwar of drab canvas, there was something eerily clerical and bleak about him, looking at us with what seemed like utter dismay or disgust. I couldn't help but feel threatened as we walked past his shop, and I looked back at him over my shoulder. That was when I saw him do it. In a fraction of a second, he snatched off his fez, looking even more threatening with his head bare, as if naked in his near baldness, cursing out loud in a deep, booming voice as he hurled it to the floor. "May you be damned," he growled after us, but we kept going, leaving him behind us as we walked on, Uncle Ibrahim and all the other men of Sidi Salem Alley, puzzled and vaguely titillated merchants standing outside their business establishments for the sole purpose of contemplating the surreal spectacle. A group of Libyan schoolgirls led by 4 women, 3 of them elegantly dressed and made up, disrupting their morning routine with the exotic, faraway scents of European perfumes. Farther up on the right side of the alley, opposite the rug merchant, there was the Lebanese pastry store. Just as we passed it, I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned around without stopping. It was Auntie Fatima, the wife of the pastry chef and mother's young protégé. Walking along beside us, she handed me a few pastries, neatly wrapped in notebook paper. I held the small package to my nose and gave her a grateful grin. Bird's nest, my favorite pastry. It smelled just like their shop, roasted nuts, melted butter, and honeycomb mixed with the rug merchant's frankincense. I put the pastry in my school satchel. Through all of this, I kept walking, not out of rudeness, but because I did not want to lose pace with Signorina Cordini, who kept walking mechanically, looking ahead in seemingly total indifference. "For you and your sister," she said, leaning over me and walking alongside me at the same time. "Have no fear. God is with you. He will give you strength, my darling little ones." When we reached the intersection of Sidi Salem and Zaroug, we turned right, and our teachers told us to keep moving, and it felt strange walking past our school without getting in through the gigantic wrought iron gate, just glancing through the bars of the gate, the empty yard, and the lone palmetto at its center, the budding mulberry trees at the back. There was a lot of bustle outside the infirmary opposite our school. A number of Bersaglieri soldiers in pith helmets and khaki uniforms were frantically unloading boxes from a military truck and into the building. By now you could clearly hear the hum of the multitude rising up over Piazza Municipio, reverberations of a crowd stirring with excited anticipation, waiting. We walked on past the madrasa and up to the widening top of the alley, where Zarug made an elbow turn toward the south, sloping upward in the direction of the Turkish gate that opened onto a tiny yard behind Atik Mosque, brow of the hillock forming the high side of Piazza Municipio. Signorina Cordini ordered us to stop at the elbow turn and jogged up the steep end of the alley, standing a few steps inside the gateway. It was rather dim where we stood, and from our lower level, the only view of Piazza Municipio was a patch of sky beyond the arc of the street gate, a seamless sheet of the purest, starkest indigo. It was a bright, balmy day out, and the sweet intoxication of the season was in the air, in the moiling hum of the rally crowd just a few steps outside that gate. Soon enough we heard it, the signal from the middle of our town square. "Attention, platoons! 1, 2, 3. With mechanical precision, Signorina Cordini turned to face us, raising her arm and motioning us forward like a traffic policeman, our formal order to commence marching toward the viewing stand in the backyard of the mosque. The next thing I knew, Zainab and I were out in the sunlight, hands held firmly by our two custodians, walking up a makeshift aisle with crowd control barriers on either side of us. Only a few yards to our right, outside the forbidden perimeter of the mosque grounds, the crowd formed an unbroken blur of massed bodies pressed together all the way over to the Marsa Street edge of the square. The only distinctly visible thing on that side was the stand set up for the military band. It had been pitched in the middle of Marsa Street and stood almost as high as a shepherd's hut. My sister and I were the first among our schoolmates to be led up the shaky wooden steps of our stand. The rest of the pupils were still milling about in the yard as the two other teachers, positioned on either side of the steps, began forming them into two lines. And now I found myself standing high up on an empty platform above everything and everyone, it seemed. The immediate perimeter of the mosque yard looked eerily deserted in contrast to the pressing throng on our right, which appeared disincarnate and foreshortened and oddly compressed, like a picture in a tiny slideshow camera. I turned around and looked down at the center of the square, suddenly petrified next to my teacher, my senses stunned by the metamorphosis of the piazza into an unrecognizable theater of festive exuberance. After the relative quiet and dimness from which we emerged, this vast blue canopied square was almost unbearable in its brightness, its uproarious clamor, its motley mosaic of clashing colors, its frenzied human swarm. Everything was happening at once in this strange splinter of time, and so dazzlingly, so emotionally, that it was impossible to see or guess which way the Duce had come. One moment he was nowhere to be seen, and the next he was facing our mosque from the middle of the piazza, perched on a black Arabian stallion in his gray uniform and eagle-emblazoned cap, stone still amid the hurricane of cheers and applause. The only other things that appeared to be quiet in this giddy moment were the monumental rectangular flags and banners that flanked the square on all sides, swaying against the Mediterranean sky like empty sails. Now the military band to our right on the Marsa Street side, starchy, solemn, gray-suited, their black helmets shining with the gilded fascist emblem, began to blare out one of the songs we had learned in school, Giovinezza. And the hailing men rimming the piazza from the sidewalks commenced to sing in one single monumental voice, their arms stretched up and out over the crowd control barriers like sticks and staves. The women waved their handkerchiefs over their heads as the men sang, and on the south side of the square, out by the podium opposite our mosque, a gigantic cardboard face of the Duce rose from among the crowd, towering above the bobbing heads, with a huge caption in thick black letters painted across the Italian flag underneath it, "Viva il Duce." For minutes after that opening song, the crowd remained mad with enthusiasm, at times managing to spontaneously orchestrate a chant that rose up from them like the mammoth two-toned retching of a gigantic beast, Duce, Duce, Duce. The dictator remained unmoving amid the riptide of cheers, his mounted figure the monumental center of a huge human square within the square, troops arrayed around him on all four sides, the men who viciously imposed his will and his power on our city, carabinieri, alpini, bersaglieri, in pith helmets, and the black uniformed MVSN militia. The crowd howled hysterically, and the mounted tyrant remained stone still within the neatly vacated area formed by his soldiers, facing our mosque, as if in contemplation, his thumbs tucked under his belt, his uniform like a statuesque suit sculpted in brushed tin. Then came the long-awaited gesture. Mussolini pulled his sword of Islam out of its sheath and raised it above his head in salute to the Cyrenian chieftains who stood opposite him by the main stairs of Atik Mosque. The upstarts, as father angrily called them, the men who had just proclaimed him protector of Islam in the secret ceremony. Shortly after his salute, the Duce dismounted, and with the crowd at a safe distance behind the barriers, he commenced to walk slowly toward the eagle-topped podium as the overlapping waves of mob madness crashed and echoed through the square. That was when Signorina Cordini and Signora Cabrini signaled the two of us, Zainab and me, to follow them. It was time to head back to our school. Flanked by the two women, we climbed down those unnaturally steep, unnervingly wobbly stairs and left our schoolmates with the other teachers. Back in the alley, the discordant clangor of the crowd raged like an unrelenting roar, but by the time we reached our school, a dead silence descended on the piazza, as sudden as the collective frenzy that had followed the dictator's appearance. The four of us went inside the school and away from it all. My sister and I were both more mystified than scared, but I was glad we had managed to walk away from the madness. There wasn't a living soul inside, and our deserted school grounds suddenly felt like a safe refuge from the chaos beyond the walls. Our teachers took us straight to the school nurse's office, where we were each given a stack of crisply folded clothes and asked to step behind a dressing screen to put on our welcoming ceremony outfits. I called out to Signorina Cordini after a while, asking her to help me with the belt. She stepped in briskly and straightened it for me, adjusted my hair snood and blouse collar. Then she put her hands on my shoulders, leaning back and studying my appearance with her grave green eyes. "Mariam," she said, "I could take you out for a stroll anywhere around the streets of Milan, and nobody would ever guess you weren't Milanese." My sister and I stepped out from behind the screens. We stood before the mirror and contemplated our sudden metamorphosis for a moment. Our welcoming ceremony outfit consisted of a white, long-sleeved silk blouse with a Peter Pan collar, a white, black-buckled linen belt, and a long black skirt. "La bruna e la rosa," Signora Cabrini exclaimed as we stood there laughing. She went to fetch the welcome note and the Duce's gift, while the two of us sat and waited by the nurse's desk. Signorina Cordini stood by the window, smoking and gazing absently into the courtyard. She had beautiful finger-wave-styled auburn hair, alabaster skin, and bore herself with the exquisite grace of a dancer. But there was no man in her life, and although she was always elegantly dressed, she rarely smiled and always stood alone in the schoolyard during recess, looking edgy and brittle-nerved like an insomniac, chain-smoking with her fingers tapping on her thigh. Our art teacher came back with the speech, a short text typed on a card, and a mother-of-pearl inlaid rosewood box that she placed atop the desk, opening it and revealing a pair of black slippers embroidered with gold thread. As chance would have it, the leather used for those slippers had been tanned and dyed in the Moroccan tannery opposite Uncle Ibrahim's shop on Sidi Salem. After that, we headed to the refectory and had a full rehearsal of our role in the ceremony that lasted till around noon, when our classmates returned from the rally and joined us for a special lunch. And then he came. After the frantic preparations, the special school meal, the nervous waiting, chauffeured by a carabinieri in a convertible command car, followed by a large retinue of local officers, state officials, and public servants. The Duce left them all at the gate of our school and entered the court alone, followed by his secretary and the carabinieri officer, who remained discreetly behind in the dimness of the archway. Not counting the officer, he was the only man in Scuola Elementare e Media Giovanni Gentile, the first male ever to set foot in our establishment during school hours. Signora Taramelli, and another horrid woman, in a similar MVSN uniform, stood at attention by one of the inner columns of the archway, with our teachers lined up close behind them, followed by the nurse, the groundskeeper, and the cook. As for us pupils, we stood in the middle of the schoolyard, arrayed like troops, with my sister and I positioned distinctly apart in the foreground, next to a side table atop which the box was set. Keeping her eyes on the archway, Zainab stood just a few steps before me with the card in her hand, her Andalusian back straight and slender and proud, her night-black ponytail glistening against the Italian shirt like a tassel of silk thread. Signora Taramelli exchanged salutes with the Duce and addressed him briefly in words we could not hear. She then pivoted aside and introduced my sister, who in our principal's words had written a short welcome speech for our Duce. Zainab snapped to attention like a soldier. As Mussolini took a few oblique steps in the direction of our schoolmates, his black riding boots clicking against the cobblestones with a crisp, metallic echo. The unnatural dead stillness of a recess yard, thronged with a platoon of perfectly lined up, utterly petrified pupils. His complexion was altered by a ruddiness that looked like a flush of latent rage. That was the first thing you noticed about him, along with the fixed expression caused by his chronic frown and the sag of his cheeks, a sad combination between a crybaby sulk and a disgusted wince that caused the skin of his face to droop on either side of his mouth. He had on the same military outfit he wore during the rally, that bizarre pewter gray cap with the fascist eagle and a matching uniform so stiff it looked like a tin suit and made him appear bodiless, standing there immobile, barely a few feet away from Zainab, contemplating our formation in silence. Finally he turned to look at my sister, and his face shifted into an incomprehensible expression. A discordant cross between a sour grimace and a smirk, as if he was unsuccessfully trying to pull a clownish face for Zainab's amusement as she stood before him, straight as a spear. Her crystal-clear voice rang out across the yard when she began to read the brief welcome speech in an Italian so excellent it made me glow with pride. And yet to this day, I still cannot recall one single word from that speech. Not that I was frightened, I believe I felt utterly incapable of fear, or even awed. In truth, my mental energies were simply too focused on the task at hand for me to grasp the details of what was happening before me. I only lived the event as pure feeling, and the feeling I have retained from that moment is that of deep, warm pride at Zainab's stunning achievement. That achievement had apparently worked its way swiftly into the heart of the semi-clownish tyrant, who looked so stiff and flushed as if straitjacketed in his otherworldly uniform. He raised his eyebrows, popped his eyes wide, and gave my sister a deep nod of respectful admiration. "Brava, brava," he said emphatically as he drew near her. Then he took the few stiff metallic steps that brought him before me and Signora Taramelli, who was now standing next to me, humbly asking him to accept this modest gift from Scuola Elementare e Media Giovanni Gentile. Before he even turned to face me, I grasped the inlaid box and stepped forward, holding it out on the flat of my palms like a tray. "Grazie," he said as he took it from me. "What is your name, little one?" "My name is Mariam Khaldoon," I replied, remembering that he did not bother to retain my sister's name. I assumed wrong, though, and was stunned when he repeated my name in Italian. "Brava, Miriam, brava," he said, as he opened the box and contemplated the gift proffered in the name of our school. The embroidered, butter-soft black slippers that glistened with a dull sheen like two horns of onyx, placed side by side on the burgundy velvet lining of the box. The mystical forms of Berber embroidery glowing in gold thread like incomprehensible talismanic formulas. He turned around and nodded at his secretary, who stepped up briskly, whispered a few words to Signora Taramelli, and took the box from him. Then he was gone, without bothering to listen to the songs that we had so painstakingly rehearsed. Mussolini just faded out of our lives like a ghost, as senselessly and phantasmagorically as he had come, followed by the tyrant's secretary and Signora Taramelli. That terrifying MVSN woman escorted Mussolini toward our principal's office, leaving us dazed and relieved and tired to our core, but also somewhat incredulous, as if we were all in doubt as to whether he had ever stopped by in the first place. My schoolmates were stunned and petrified, but they still remained respectfully at attention, until Signorina Cordini managed to shake herself out of her amazement, stepping up and announcing to all that the event we had put together went beautifully, that the Duce was very satisfied with Scuola Elementare Media Giovanni Gentile. Unfortunately, she added, there was no time for the songs. He had to attend a brief meeting, then rush to Stadio Comunale for the camelry parade and the equestrian fantasia of the Berber horsemen. Much to our relief, she released us early, and as we rushed out into the unusually crowded alley, my sister and I realized that Antar was nowhere to be seen. We walked home unaccompanied, ambling happily around the most out-of-the-way alleys, and as we stepped through the women's gate into the peaceful seclusion of the back court, Zainab seized my hand, looking at me in silence for a few seconds, eyebrows raised, eyes wide open, her cherry blossom cheeks slightly puffed out, and her lips tightened together in a theatrically suppressed guffaw. She was rendering the facial expression of someone who was about to burst out with laughter. "Did you notice the horrible, horrible scandal?" she asked, recomposing her face into a cunning smile, whispering like a conspirator. "What scandal?" "Signora Taramelli is so much taller than Mussolini." "That's right," I screamed. "That's the first thing I know." "Shh, not so loud," my sister whispered, tugging at my hand. "Not so loud. Those creepy MVSN crows are probably still spying on our house. Remember what Uncle Ibrahim said?" "That's exactly what I thought when she talked to him in the archway," I whispered. "She should be the Duce. After all, she does have her own uniform." My sister had a streak of wild playfulness in her that always reminded me of Ali. Taking her cue from my verdict, she stepped back, assumed a comically stern military expression, and raised her hand in Roman salute. "Saluto a Taramelli," she said. "A noi," I replied, and we both exploded into laughter. Unfortunately, there wasn't much laughter for our family after that day, starting with Father, who soon began to sink into his private hell of implacable depression. Before Mussolini's visit, my sister and I used to see him once a week in the men's salon on allowance day. Those treasured Friday mornings were the only time we were permitted into the benzoin and sandalwood-scented male sanctum where he reigned supreme. The man we called Father, his Sphinxian features, half Andalusian, half Phoenician, tightly framed by that perpetual scarlet fez, his black beard as dense and even as steel wool, his nose proud and elegant and straight, like the exquisite barb of an arrow carved out of sandalwood. The indirect manner in which I communicated with him during those sessions was similar to the way most girls of our class and upbringing spoke with their fathers. A very formal, very lopsided exchange within a setting closely controlled by Mother, who sat like an interpreter between the two of us during those Friday conversations, which always ended with that final, comforting, paternal pronouncement, Mashallah, Mariam, Brawa. It was quite simply unthinkable for us girls to address our father directly, and so everything I needed to say to the head of our family had to be carefully rehearsed with Mother before I sat down and faced him. The head of our family would sit in his armchair like a monarch, beneath that most emblematic symbol of protection, his beloved Damascene silver plate adorning the wall with a Hamza sign at its center. During the last conversation I had with Father, I remember us talking about my school achievements and our family heritage. The conversation went smoothly and unusually long. It was a first, a Friday session fully dedicated to me, as if in compensation for the long, abysmal silence to come. I don't remember how long we spoke, but I can clearly visualize how humbly satisfied I was, just glad to be sitting there before Father, contemplating the distant glow of Father's barely contained pride, the tentative warmth of Father's oblique gaze, the uplifting power of Father's indirect words. And yet soon enough, there came that inevitable moment, Mother's formulaic announcement that it was time for me to stand up and take my allowance, which I did. Gratefully, deferentially, my head slightly bent forward, I stood up, as I always did, and tiptoed around the coffee table to take my money, kiss my father's hand, and walk out with Mother, never to set foot in the men's salon until the next Friday. Then the tyrant came to town, and those strange, deeply treasured Friday conversations with Father came to a sudden, irrevocable end. In my memory, the interruption itself is, of course, one of the darkest moments of my childhood. But what hurt even more than the sense of personal doom surrounding our separation was the fact that I was not able to grasp the reason for his lofty silence. I did not know why I was sentenced to this hiatus, and after a while I began to complain to Mother about it. "He's upset," she would just reply, her emerald eyes misting over, her face, my twin face, twisted with pain. Typically, after that helpless acknowledgement of my father's utter unreachability, his retreat into the dark recesses of depression, Mother would resort to her usual plea for divine justice. "May God take revenge on you, Mussolini," she would cry out, words of invocation uttered in the sweet, slightly slurred tones of the Alexandrine Turks. So now, suddenly, jarringly, circumstances had imposed one more responsibility upon me, and emotional adjustments had to be made, if only to help myself cope with the harsh new realization gnawing away at me. That one face-to-face Friday chat, furtive and frigid and formalized as it was, had now become a thing of the past, a self-indulgent luxury from which I had to learn to wean myself. Henceforth, my allowance would be handed to me by Mother every Friday. That much I knew for certain. Father had retreated into the shadows well before his passing, before the grinding force of history had turned him into another eternally displaced figure, enshrined in a photographic portrait next to Grandfather and Omar Mukhtar. One more monumental ghost among the restless, clangorous ghosts of the resistance. He was buried March 26, 1939, and while our extended family had gradually found a measure of peace, eventually coming to terms with the horror of his untimely death, the five of us were left with the lingering ache of his absence, which was in many ways far more terrible than the manner of his departure. I never really thought of an alternative to the way he was, the way things were in those days for a father and his daughter. But it would be dishonest to say that those Friday glimpses of father had never left me with a nameless sense of incompletion or even emptiness, perhaps. It was always as if the entire experience had a certain power, independent of either of us, to make me feel helpless and small before this one irrepressible realization. The wordless awareness that although our Friday hour was so dearly desirable, there was something about the space in which it took place that I found impossible to accept. A physical force, maybe, that invested the whole room with the primal power of impingement, entirely detached from his personal beliefs or volition, a mute, relentless agency acting like a harsh and hostile environment fraught with elemental properties that were fundamentally toxic for both of us, as alien and unnatural to both our beings as the deep sea is to the novice diver. An environment in some that contained none of the familiar substances of our world, and that I took some form of eerie and irresistible delight in navigating, even though I knew full well that it was treacherous and impossible to trust and take for granted, inconceivable to settle in and call my own. Mashallah, Mariam, Brawa. The only time I remember him saying my name.